I've asked you this question before, and I will ask it again. Have you ever been lost? And the answer you've given me is yes. And this story comes from the tale of the tawny ox cart by Charles Swindoll. And Peter was lost. He wasn't just lost. He was hopelessly lost. He was in the desert. And he was wandering in the desert, and he was thirsty, he was hungry, and the sun that was blazing down upon him was making him very faint. And finally, in his wanderings, he found an old hut. And he got into its shade, and he sat there, recovering from the warmth, the searing sun, and then he noticed that there was a pump 15 feet away from the hut. And so he staggered over to the pump, and he started cranking the handle of it, and all it would do was creak, but no water came out. So, very deflated, he went back into the hut, and he was lying there, and he looked, and he saw a jug. It was dusty, because there's no windows in the hut, and he went over there, and he started to take the dust off it, and noticed that there was a cork, but there was also a message in it. And the message simply said this. It said, this jug is full of water. You are to use this water to prime the pump. When you get water from the pump, you are to refill it for the next person who comes. Peter knew there was water there. And now he was in a dilemma. He was absolutely perished for it. He was thirsty. He wanted to drink that water. And so he sat down and he thought about it. I could quench my thirst now. Or I could put it down into the pump to prime it, and I'll get more water. But what if the pump won't prime? Thought more about it, and finally decided that he would try to prime the pump. So he poured the water down the pump, and he started to pump it, and it just creaked again, and finally there was kind of a sputter, and some dirty water came out, and then pure water, lots of it came out, and he was satisfied. His thirst was no more. And so he filled up the jug again, and he wrote a note beside it that simply said, it's real. You have to give something away to get more back. And that's the lesson here in our passage. We have to give up to receive more. So we have in Luke chapter 10, verses 1 to 7, about a centurion and his slave that was sick to death. There are 5 things that we're going to look at, and they're very practical. The first one is a crisis. The centurion had a crisis. His servant or slave was ill to death. If he didn't get any help, he would lose someone he respected and loved and highly valued. He was in a crisis. And who was this man? He was a centurion. He was over 100 soldiers. He was an employee of Atlas Caesar. He was in the Roman army. And what his duty was around Capernaum was simply to keep the peace and customs. He collected customs tax. And so his slave, and I say slave for a reason, because our passage says it's a servant, but it was actually a slave. And when we think of slaves, we think of before the Civil War down in the States, where the slaves were treated badly, and many of them were. Or we think of white slavery, where people are put into prostitution, and we know that the conditions are really bad. But in our case, in the case of the Roman Empire, many of the slaves were treated very well. They became slaves simply because a mother had a child and abandoned them, and the family took them in as a slave, and they became loved as a part of a family member. There were others who lived in poverty and sold themselves into slavery. And there were those who were born as slaves simply because their parents were slaves. But there were the ones that were treated badly, and those were the criminals. And they usually died. But an ordinary slave would be freed about 30 years old. They would be able to buy their freedom. They would be able to be granted freedom by their master, or it would be in the master's will. And so this man had the slave who he highly respected and loved, and he was in crisis because that man was going to die, and we ourselves will find ourselves in crisis at times. Whether it's a financial crisis, whether it's a health crisis, whether it is a crisis that's an interpersonal crisis where someone has died, we will find ourselves in a crisis. And the lesson we can learn is this: when we find ourselves in a crisis, or not such a crisis, but we have a need, what did the centurion do? He went to Christ. And that's what we also should do. Worthy or not worthy? That's something what we struggle with as human beings at times. Maybe you've never struggled with it, but most of us have at one time or another. Are we worthy of such a relationship? Are we worthy of a job? Are we worthy of such an honor? But what's being talked about here is, are we worthy before God? And this centurion sent a delegation of the Jewish community to Jesus, asking for help. And they certainly felt that he was worthy. They said, look what he's done. He loves our nation. He treats us with respect. And not only that, out of his own pocket, he built us a synagogue. So who was this centurion? He was most likely a God-fearer. A God-fearer was a man or a woman who left the ways, the pagan ways of their gods, goddesses, and started to worship the true and only God. The only thing they didn't do was be circumcised, and therefore they couldn't join the Jewish faith. And so this man had sent a delegation to Jesus. Whether he considered himself worthy of Jesus at this point in our passage, we don't know. But it's something to think about ourselves. Are we worthy before God? We might think we are, and we may be, but do we have that assurance that we're worthy before God? That we stand before God in Christ's righteousness? Not worthy. This man considered himself not worthy. We find out in our passage as we begin to read it further. And one would wonder why he did not consider himself worthy. Was it because he was a Gentile? That he belonged to the Roman army? Or was it something else? And we find that it was something else. Because he sent another delegation, some friends. And he sent the friends because some of the Jewish people had come back and told him that Jesus was coming to his house. So he sent the other delegations, and he said, Lord, don't be troubled with me. I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not come to you, because I didn't think I was worthy enough. What's happening here? Here we have a man who realizes who Jesus is. He had heard about Christ. He had never met Christ. But he knew that Jesus was something far beyond anything he had ever seen or experienced. He realized there was something about this man that was godly, and powerful, and loving, and kind, and compassionate, and gracious. He was like that tax collector who came into the temple, went to the farthest place, the darkest place he could find, and he simply said, God, forgive me a sinner. He understood, and we need to understand that everything is by grace. We stand in the righteousness of Christ alone. Remember John Newton's song, Amazing Grace? The first two verses say, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. He was a humble man, even though he was a powerful man. Under authority. This is something we don't understand as well as they did in the days of Jesus. We live in a democracy. And so we don't always find and think of ourselves of being under authority. But this man did. But when he said, I'm not worthy, did that mean that this man gave up wanting his servant healed? Did he say to himself and others, I want Jesus to leave. I want nothing to have with him, nothing to do with him? No, he said something really incredible. He said, speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I say to the one, go, and he goes. To the other, come, and he comes. I say to my servants, do this, and they do it. He understood what authority was all about. And he knew that Christ was one who had power and authority. This man himself was in a position of authority over those 100 soldiers. But he himself was under authority by his superiors, and his superiors were under authority by other superiors. And ultimately it went right back to Caesar. So that when he issued a command, that is, that centurion issued a command, it was under the authority and the power of the whole Roman army and Caesar himself. He realized that Jesus had authority over sickness and illness and even death itself. And we should realize that as well. In Philippians chapter 2, it talks about Jesus' death and how he humbled himself. And then it says, therefore God has exalted him to the highest place and given him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In other words, Jesus is sitting beside the right hand of God the Father on the throne of heaven. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. When he says, it is to be done, it is done. That's why we can come to God in prayer. That's why we can ask him for help. And we can be assured that when God says, let it be, it will be. So what was Jesus' response? Well, he was in amazement. It only tells us 2 times that Christ was amazed. And it all happened around Capernaum. The first time that he was amazed was when he first came back from doing many miracles to Capernaum. And when he came there, he could hardly heal anyone. And he was amazed at the hardness of their hearts. And now he was amazed. Because this man wasn't a Jewish person. Most of the Jewish people would consider that he had no faith. After all, he was a Gentile. He was a Roman soldier. He was the one that suppressed them. And yet this man said, "Speak the word, and my servant will be healed." And he said, "I have not found such faith in Israel itself." You know, every time I read this passage, I have to ask myself a question. The question is this: how does God see my faith, my trust in him? Do I have the faith of a centurion, or maybe even half of that? And we all need to ask that question. Do we really see Jesus sitting on the throne over the heavens and the earth, sitting on his throne as the throne of grace where we can come to him in prayer? And when we come to him, we are ushered into that throne room. And when our prayers go up to him, he hears them. Sometimes he answers with a no, but he also answers with a yes, sometimes immediately. But sometimes the prayer is answered with a yes, but it takes some time to work it out. But he's still there, and he's still in authority, and when he speaks, it is done. The centurion realized this. He asked Christ to speak the word, and his servant was healed. Let us always, in a crisis and at all other times, come to the throne of grace and expect God to speak and act on our behalf.